Hello from Jerusalem, and welcome once again to Beit. We've covered the urban development of Jerusalem during Ottoman, British, and then Israeli times. So this session will be devoted to the post-Oslo Accords period. And leading this delicate discussion is with us urban political geographer, Dr. Marik Shtern. Marik's research puts a focus on divided cities and the relations between groups sharing a space. Dr. Shtern is a senior lecturer and heads the urban living and society area in the architecture department at the Sami Shamun College of Engineering. The chat is here for you to use for your questions, and at the end, Marik will devote a few minutes to answering. Thank you, Marik, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our fourth and last chapter of Discovering Jerusalem, the post-Oslo Accords. Today, we are entering the current times, and we're going to discuss a period which I think is very dramatic and important in the history of Jerusalem. I call it post-Oslo, that's my terminology. Because in my opinion, the Oslo Peace Accords during the 90s, and especially their collapse, has changed dramatically the geopolitics of a city, its demography, its geography, and probably its future as well, posing important questions about the way in which Israel can withhold its control over East Jerusalem, about whether the two growing demographic groups in the city, the ultra-Orthodox and the Palestinians, as you see in the lovely picture of Chaim Rivlin here in Mamila Mall, can they hold together, being together the majority of the population, the city, while ignoring each other and being in very antagonistic relations themselves? What would be the future of the city with the shrinking secular Jewish population? How could it withstand itself economically within such a reality? So it's an important question, but we also will highlight some positive trends within this period, some changes, and maybe some strings of hope to the future. In our last episode, I left you discussing the 1980s, a period which I describe as relatively a good and positive period in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was united, of course, a very contested unification. In East Jerusalem, you have a large, approximately third of the overall population of the city are Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, but relatively until 1987, the borders are open around the city. There is a free movement. The city enjoys positive immigration, Jewish and Arab immigration. People coming to the city, new neighborhoods were built, mostly for Jews in East Jerusalem, but also the Palestinian neighborhoods were expanding during this time, and at least economically, the city was developing. And maybe the highlight of the period is what we see here, the flagship of urban renewal in the 80s in Jerusalem, the pedestrian street of Ben Yehuda, the Midrachov, how we call it in Hebrew. They took the main shopping district of Jerusalem, Ben Yehuda Street, which was very dense and polluted, and converted it into a pedestrian way. And it was a successful project. Very simply put, tourists came, the residents came to shop. I remember as a child walking on Friday noon in the Midrachov at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. The street is full of people from all over the city. But maybe this moment in history where it seems as if Teddy Kollek project, which I mentioned, that Mayor Teddy Kollek project in the city of trying to alleviate it from its peripheral position into a universal city, a city that celebrates high culture, a city for which people from all over the world, celebrities, artists, musicians, and etc., are coming to its annual events. It seems as if in the 80s this is working. The poster which you see in here is the Israel Festival, an annual event that took place in Jerusalem every year, bringing artists from Israel, but also international artist. In May 1987, the major event in the festival was a French artist, a French wire walker, that put a rope between Har Zion, which is adjacent to the old city, and then Hotel Zion, which is across the valley of Hinnom, and walked across the valley that connects or divides between East and West Jerusalem. And thousands of people came to watch him walk this distance only with a stick. And he himself mentioned that he's doing it for peace, for the connection of East and West Jerusalem. It was a symbolic, thrilling act. In the middle of his walk, a pigeon comes and sits on his balance stick, and suddenly he lost his balance. He had to sit down and waited till the pigeon, or a dove, you can call it, this bird, flew away, and then he continued. He managed to go across, and the event overall was quite successful, but that was May 1987. Half a year afterwards, in December, the 9th of December, a car accident in Gaza Strip, in which a dozen of Palestinian workers were killed, this event developed into mass protest, a popular resistance of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza against the Israeli occupation. We won't go into deep into that event, but only to mention its impact on Jerusalem. Those mass demonstrations, called the intifada, the first uprising, continued approximately for 3 and 4 years until the beginning of the 90s. A wave of political violence, terror, you would say even police retaliation or army retaliation, and all the sins that we know now were relatively new back then. That was the first time in which Israeli army forces and even police had to address such a mass civic unrest. And Jerusalem was at the center of it. And this is the cover of a very popular journal, a Jerusalemite journal called Kol Ha'ir. It was a very important paper during the 80s and the 90s, a sort of New York Times local edition. And many of the major journalists that today active in Israel grew up as journalists in this paper. And this is the cover from the same week of the eruption of the first intifada, and I will translate for you, those who can't read Hebrew. It says, Ketz hatminut, the end of naivety. And in the pictures back down here, we see various scenes: East Jerusalem, Atur, Beit Safafa, Palestinian locations in East Jerusalem in ruins. The riots came to East Jerusalem, and the end of nativity, what they're trying to say, the end of naivety means that for 20 years there was an illusion that the unification project of Jerusalem was a success. And now this illusion blew up in the face of decision makers, in the face of Jerusalemites. And that happened in the same year of 1997, and I think that from that point on, we see how political violence, unrest, terror, geography of fear became embedded in the geography of the city, became part of its reality, part of the image of Jerusalem, the inner image of Jerusalem among Israelis, but also, of course, the international image of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem still struggles to kind of alienate itself from this image, to try to come over it, but it's a very hard process. The geopolitics of the regions infiltrated the city. And if we're going back to the early 90s, another process starts at the same time. So we have the first intifada coming for Jerusalem, reviving the Green Line, creating those spaces of fear of which Jews are trying not to cross across the border, not to cross through Palestinian neighborhoods. Palestinians also trying to avoid entering West Jerusalem, but they have less options, they have to come to work. But another movement starts as a reaction, maybe. It started in the beginning of the 80s, but it reinforces during the 90s, which is the settlement of small groups of settlers in Arab localities in East Jerusalem. At the beginning, the Muslim quarter and the area of the city of David, of Silwan, but later on also in Har HaZeitim, in Sheikh Jarrah, in other localities. It's an ideological religious movement that, saying bluntly, they want to Judaize parts of East Jerusalem. They're mostly NGOs, private, but have in some occasions the support of the government or the security of the government, and etc. In the picture you see Yeshivat Ateret Kohanim in the Muslim quarter. That's one of the first settlements, and I mentioned that because those micro settlements, and overall they do not represent a large demographic phenomena. Even today we count them as 3,000, I would say, Jewish residents that live in those settlements in East Jerusalem, spread all over, among a population of 400,000. That's not a major demographic issue, but they do create those ongoing points of friction and events that going on in Silwan or in Sheikh Jarrah are going wide, public, all over the world. And of course, going on with our chronology, in 1993, the Peace Oslo Accords are signed between Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the representative of the Palestinian movement, as you see, with Bill Clinton in the middle. And suddenly, a contrary, I would say, trend starts. If we talked about the entrance of political violence and unrest, this actually involves the emergence of the peace discourse and the development of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which you see on the right hand. And in those accords, they decided, one of their major decisions was to postpone the issue of Jerusalem to later stage, to the permanent stage of the agreements. So they didn't change anything in Jerusalem, mostly only in the West Bank, in Gaza, where the autonomy, or sort of autonomy, was created. But Jerusalem was highly affected by this transition, especially East Jerusalem. Because one of the decisions of how do you keep Jerusalem for future discussions, you have to isolate it from the West Bank. In the West Bank, Palestinians have their own movement between it's fractuated movement, of course, but they decided that around Jerusalem, now you will have checkpoints that filter the movement of Palestinians into Israel. And for the first time, East Jerusalem was cut off its hinterland, cut off the villages which were its suburbs mostly, right? Or small towns then, like Ramallah or Bethlehem, that served Jerusalem. East Jerusalem used to be the center of this metropolitan area, and now with the insertion of checkpoints at the beginning, and we'll talk later on the separation barrier, there was this physical barrier that disconnected East Jerusalem from its surrounding area, leading within Jerusalem to an economic collapse. Because think about it, every Friday until the checkpoints or the wall, Palestinians from the West Bank, from Bethlehem, Ramallah, Nablus, whatever, could come to pray in Al-Aqsa. They would do their shoppings there. It was the center of their social space, Palestinian social space. Even the political leadership of the Palestinians until the end of the 80s sat in Jerusalem. The major newspaper, cultural institutions, tourism, and etc. So it was somehow thriving within these conditions. But following the 90s, especially the Oslo Peace Accords, with this process, this disconnection leads to a decay of East Jerusalem. The political center moves to Ramallah, the touristic center moves to Bethlehem, and the customers are not coming anymore. And we will discuss how it affected East Jerusalemites pretty soon, but I want to move to another major events that happened during the 90s of the 20th century, the age of contestation, I would call it, the huge mass terror attacks in Israel and especially in Jerusalem, suicidal explosions in buses, in Jaffa Street, in Ben Yehuda Street, all over the city, again and again, sometimes twice a week. Again, between 2000, during the 19th, but also between 2000 and 2005, what we call the second intifada. This is the site of another major explosion in the Sbarro restaurant in 2002. In each event, you have dozens of people killed and much more injured. Very traumatic. Myself, I remember living as a student in Jerusalem in the 2000s, working in the city center. The reality felt like a Russian roulette. You never knew if you would go on a bus, if you will get off of it alive. And things happen all the time around you. So it's a major trauma in our collective memory of West Jerusalem during the 19th and the 2000s. So all these events which I just discussed, the agreements, the intifadas, the terror attacks, the barriers around East Jerusalem, it's like this period of a very tense period in which Jerusalem enters at the end of the 80s from one hand as one city, and when it leaves this process at 2004, 2005 into the post-Oslo period, it's already a different city. I will move forward, but this is just a graph showing the amount of terror attacks in Jerusalem in different decades. So this is in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and look at the high rise, the high number of events in the 90s and then in the 2000s. In purple, we see attacks made by the Fatah, the PLO events, and in orange, this is a new organization, the Hamas, that emerges in the 90s and becomes this major player until today. And now the end of the period, I would say, is the construction of the separation wall. As I mentioned, the separation wall is built by the Israeli government between 2004 and 2007 in order to stop the infiltration of terrorists from the West Bank into Jerusalem. The checkpoints were not enough. They had to put up a wall, a barriered wall, to prevent those things from happening. And security-wise, apparently, it was successful because the second intifada was done by 2005, and you didn't have anymore those kind of weekly, every or even monthly events of terrorist attack happening in West Jerusalem anymore. But on the other hand, the wall had side effects that were not anticipated that changed Jerusalem in a different way. For example, once they build the wall around Jerusalem, some of the Palestinian neighborhoods that were belonging to Jerusalem, that were part of East Jerusalem, like Shoafat refugee camp or Aram, were now left beyond the wall. And once they constructed the wall, there was mass immigration from those suburbs into Jerusalem from a fear that those Palestinians that are left outside the wall would not be able to enter Jerusalem anymore. But with the development of the events, they saw that actually you can live in those enclaves. Not only that you can live in those enclaves and go across checkpoints into Jerusalem on a daily basis, but also those enclaves became no man's land of Jerusalem. And this is a picture of refugee camp in Shoafat, a place which officially is under the control of Israel, under the authority of the Israeli municipality, but nobody almost enters it. There are no municipal services, but also no inspection or planning authority control. So you see all those high rises built here were not planned, built really densely one next to the other, because there is high demand. And I will explain a bit further why there is a high demand to live there, but this is the main source of affordable housing today in East Jerusalem, in those two enclaves. And I will continue a bit further on. Another impact of the wall, which I mentioned, was this cutoff of the area across, cutoff East Jerusalem from the customers, from the economic movement, and etc., created an influx of poverty in East Jerusalem, with levels of poverty rising up to 82% of the population in East Jerusalem living under the poverty line by the end of the 2000s. That was kind of the, I would say, the record numbers of poverty in East Jerusalem. From that point on, we see a reorientation of economy and labor in East Jerusalem, reorienting itself towards West Jerusalem. Today, this is the latest number. You see the number of persons living under poverty line as 58%. So we actually see an improvement, and some of this improvement is related to the fact that more and more Palestinians, since the construction of the wall, are actually working in West Jerusalem. I will come next to this slide just to explain something about East Jerusalemites in general. East Jerusalemites are a different group than Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinians living in the West Bank. Their status is an interim status in between. They don't have a full citizenship. They have a permanent residency. What does it mean? It means that, for example, they can't vote to the government, but they can vote only to the municipality of Jerusalem. Another difference is that they don't have a passport. Each time they want to travel abroad, they have to issue a temporary document called laissez-passer. They don't have visa to any country in the world. Most of them has no citizenship, so they are just left without any citizenship status, civic status whatsoever. And the last difference between residential status and citizenship is the fact that the residency can be revoked much easily than citizenship. Citizenship is a very solid status, even in Israel. Even if, God forbid, you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel and you commit a terror attack, it's almost impossible for the authorities to revoke your citizenship. But residency can be much more easily revoked. And this fear of revokement is always, I would say, hovering on top of the heads of East Jerusalemites, leading, and what is interesting about it, that Palestinians can apply individually to have Israeli citizenship. And as you can see, after 67 in this graph, there were a number of 1,000, maybe a few thousands of Palestinians did apply. But then, from that point on, almost zero. It was considered as a taboo. If you apply for an Israeli citizenship, or even if you go and vote to the municipality, that is called normalization. You give legitimacy to the Israeli occupation. And they did not want to do that. And one effect of that since 67 until today, there are no council members from East Jerusalem in Jerusalem City Council. But if you see the change in the graph, in the middle of the 2000s, after the second intifada, with the construction of the wall, a sudden rise of applications and approvals of citizenship for East Jerusalemites. It's still small numbers. We probably talk about today 5% of the total population of East Jerusalemites that have Israeli citizenship. Maybe this number has rose a bit in the last years, but still a small minority, but it represents the tip of the trend, which I call functional Israelization. Actually, the construction of the wall pushes the Palestinians in East Jerusalem into West Jerusalem. And I mean pushes symbolically, but pushes them into the labor market, into the higher education system, and on the tip of this process, even into applying for Israeli citizenship. It's important to mention that at the same time, where we see this Israelization, we also have an opposite trend of nationalization and radical religious movements that become stronger, and suddenly Jerusalem in the 2000s and even after the intifada creates activists that commit terror attacks in West Jerusalem, some young people that go and try to run over other Jews standing on the sidewalk, and etc. And those two trends of radicalization and Israelization coexist, sometimes even among the same persons. These are part of the paradox of Jerusalem. They are caught by the wall within Israel, and they have to adapt to this transition. So in order to survive, they integrate into the economy of West Jerusalem, into the economy of Israel. Some of them in record numbers go to the Hebrew University, to Israeli colleges, but at the same time, it creates a resentment of a feeling of being kind of coerced into Israeli space. West Jerusalem, on the other hand, become, during this period, in the last 20 years, much more mixed space, demographically mixed space, because think about it, if the number of Palestinians in East Jerusalem is growing, and the infrastructures there was limited from the start. There are almost no parks in East Jerusalem, no shopping malls, not many places to recreate or to enjoy yourself, to have fun with your family. So most of the Palestinians, when they want to go to a park, they would go to West Jerusalem. When they want to shop, they will go to shops, to the shopping malls of West Jerusalem. The light train that was inaugurated in 2010 was the first public transport line that connected some of the Palestinian neighborhoods in the north of East Jerusalem, I will show you in the map, into the city center of Jerusalem, creating it a much easier way to come and shop and go back through public transport. So all those trends only show you how the impact of the wall was much more extended even beyond East Jerusalem into West Jerusalem, created what I call a new geography of encounter. Jews and Palestinians meet each other on a daily basis today much more than they used to meet each other in earlier decades because of those processes. And those new shared spaces or spaces of encounter become one of the major topics. How can you handle a park where you have families sit side by side that are afraid of each other, and feeling hostility in many cases towards each other, but they're enjoying the same facilities. Palestinians coming as guests into foreign territories, and Jews feeling like their home is invaded, I would say, in process by those Palestinians. Of course, we know those processes happen all over the world, but here you have the load of, I would say, the ethno-national tensions and the fear of political violence on top of it. Now, leaving one subject and moving to a totally different but in many ways connected, same demographic changes, spatio-demographic changes, took place in West Jerusalem as well, between in the intergroup relations, I would say, between seculars, religious, and ultra-Orthodox Jews living in West Jerusalem. Back in the 80s, where we started, ultra-Orthodox Jews was a small minority, approximately 20% of the total Jewish population, living in their own ultra-Orthodox enclaves of North Jerusalem. I will show you in the map, mostly in this area, in the center. Expanding already in the 70s and the 80s, Haredim, we call it in Hebrew, Haredim moved to adjacent neighborhoods, But still, they were a minority. It was an issue, but it wasn't the biggest issues in the 80s. But time moves on, and demography does its thing. Ultra-Orthodox families has in average 7 children, while secular family has 2 or 3, and religious family maybe 4 and 5. But once a generation passes by, exponential growth. Today, the ultra-Orthodox population is the biggest group among the Jewish population. They are consisting approximately 50% of the Jewish population, while secular Jews, that used to be the biggest group in the 80s, they around 50 to 60%, are now below 20%. So a total, I would say, reversal or a change, transformation in demographic relations within the Jewish population. And of course, this transition has a geographical impact. And you see in this map, which denotes in which neighborhoods you have a majority of ultra-Orthodox and in which you have a small percentage. Today, you have either Haredi neighborhoods in West Jerusalem or, I would say, mixed secular, Dati, Haredi neighborhoods in West Jerusalem. And this process is one of the major events of to whom Jerusalem belongs to. When people come from Tel Aviv or Haifa, secular Israelis, let's say, still the major group in the country, they come to Jerusalem and they see mostly either Dati or Haredi people. It creates a sense of alienation towards Jerusalem, which is a major risk to its status, its symbolic status, its national status, and also to the way we perceive ourselves as nations, but as a nation, as a one nation. But of course, and it's interesting to compare those two transitions which I just mentioned. The Palestinian Israelization can be parallel also to a trend of Haredi Israelization, because while the Haredi population is expanding in Jerusalem, but also all over Israel, it also changes throughout this process. The margins of the society is growing. There is a new, I would say, Haredi class that you call it modern Haredi or Israeli Haredim that want actually to live in a mixed neighborhood, that are working, some of them in high-tech positions and etc. Besides their external attire, they do live a modern life and prefer to do so. So this is a growing group within the Haredi population. They see themselves as part of the Haredi world, but in many ways they are becoming modern Orthodox. Also, you see a drop in the birth ratio among those ultra-Orthodox groups. So the margins are growing. The ability of the rabbinic figures, of the leadership, to control those masses, and we talk about hundreds of thousands of people all over Israel, and only in Jerusalem 300,000, the ability of them to control, to see where all the children are, to block the connection between them and the secular world, something that was a major issue once, becomes almost impossible. Today they say that the majority of the Haredi population has a smartphone, has a connection to the internet. They know how the world looks like. They are connected to the secular worlds in Israel and abroad, and it changes them. So there is a big, I would say, question mark of what it would be, what does it mean, what will it mean to be a Haredi person in the next generation, in the future. So we see the statistical trends, but it doesn't tell us the whole sociological story. Going back to the 90s, and I'm jumping forward and back, but trying to keep the story as a whole, the reaction of the secular population in Jerusalem to the Haredi growth was what I say charada in Hebrew, anxiety, a social anxiety. During the 90s, this is a brochure from the local elections of Meretz. You probably know the liberal leftist party. They run to the municipality and they put this brochure. What kind of Jerusalem would you like? free or Haredi. And you see this black image of Jerusalem and all those. And in other brochure, which I didn't brought here, you see a map of Jerusalem and the expansion of Haredi population to different neighborhoods. In many ways, it was actually the political leaders of seculars in Jerusalem that created and encouraged a sensation of anxiety, of fear of the future. You know, politically wise, it was clever. People came and voted them in high numbers, in record numbers. They became part of the coalition or outside of it, but they had political power. But on the other hand, since the 19th and today, seculars in Jerusalem feel they live in a context in which they feel they are on ticking clock, right? We don't know. Sometime in the future, Jerusalem would not be able to house us anymore. It would be Haredi, it would be dangerous, there would be religious coercion, and etc. I'm not saying that this will not happen, but actually this perspective was created at the end of the 80s and early 90s, when secular Jews were still the majority of the population. And in many ways, their prophecy kind of materialized itself. And I brought you here, I'm sorry, there's a lot of Hebrew text, but another trend that happened, as I mentioned, is the alienation between the public in Israel in general towards Jerusalem, mostly the liberal public in Israel. These are some articles from Haaretz, you probably know, the newspaper Haaretz, a left-oriented newspaper, and every year you would have their opinion pieces or articles and etc., claiming the hatred of the people writing in this paper towards Jerusalem, animosity, alienations. It said here, seculars, get out of the closet, it's okay not to love Jerusalem, the scary face of New Jerusalem, I hate Jerusalem, a done city. And this is just a small connection. So again, we see that things that happen in Jerusalem are also embedded within the social, I would say, polarization of the Israeli society as a whole, between the liberals and the conservatives, between the left and the right. And from the 90s and forward, Jerusalem is seen from outside within Israel as part of this conservative religious bloc, the city of the other, I would say, either the religious other or even the Palestinian other, but not definitely something that is different from the classic Zionist secular socialist Jews that established Israel. And this is also an interesting graph showing how Jerusalem is a mirror image of the demography of the country today. And I will translate. Here you see seculars, Masorti, religious, ultra-religious. In pink, you see Israel. So seculars in Israel are 45%. In Jerusalem, they are 15%. On the other end, 46% of the Jewish population in Israel are Haredi, and only 15% of the total population in Israel. So actually, Jerusalem is a mirror image of the society in Israel, a negative towards a positive, or whatever side you want to look at it. But again, I think it illuminates really clearly how it fits within the social discourse today, the political social discourse. Now, for the last 5 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions, I want to go through the mayors that ruled Jerusalem and still rule it through this post-Oslo period. The first one was Ehud Olmert. He succeeded Teddy Kollek, and Ehud Olmert was the first, I would say, right-wing Likud mayor of the city. That was the first change, I would say, in the political hegemony that controlled the city, from the central left, socialist left, represented by Teddy Kollek, not really socialist, but by tags, let's say, to the right-wing Likud mayor, but still a secular mayor, Ehud Olmert, and his period was mostly characterized by mass constructions of roads, of buildings. He was this kind of a capitalist entrepreneur in his character, and also affiliated with many corruption I would say, projects that eventually put him into prison during the end of the 2000s. Moving on, in 2003, during the second intifada, the first Haredi mayor in Jerusalem came into power, Uri Lupulyansky. So imagine how Jerusalem is changing rapidly within a decade. Just a decade before, in 2003, there was Teddy Kollek, a secular domination, and then intifada, first, second, and the Haredi mayor. For many people, that transition was too dramatic. And clearly we see that the biggest demographic change within the Jewish population happens during the 2000s, the major drop in the percentage of seculars within the larger Jewish population. But in 2008, a new secular mayor, Nir Barkat, came into power. He did identify himself with the right. That was his only option to be elected in a conservative city as Jerusalem at this point of time. But he did give, I would say, a positive wind of trying to revive Jerusalem as a liberal center. Of course, that doesn't ally with other things that he thought we should do it, I'd say, towards Palestinians in East Jerusalem. He was a hawkish, I would say, politically, but still, he tried to create those cultural events, sports, the Marathon of Jerusalem, Formula One, major events in the old city, and trying to create a Jerusalem which is more fun, less heavy, and etc. He was successful for a while, but again, you can't really fight the reality in Jerusalem. In 2014, what we call the Knives Intifada or El-Aqsa Intifada erupted, and Jerusalem found itself again within a wave of political violence, terrorism, which concentrated in Jerusalem. And following this event, you couldn't come and sell Jerusalem again as a fun city of the restaurant Machne Yehuda and etc. It was much harder work until today. And after 2 terms, Nir Barkat leaves for national politics, and a new mayor enters. Today, this time it's his second term, Moshe Leon. A very interesting, I would say, profile of a politician, of a local politician. First of all, he's the first Mizrahi mayor in Jerusalem since the establishment of the state, or since ever, right? The Jewish Mizrahi. Although Mizrahi Jews are the majority of the population in Jerusalem throughout its modern times, throughout all the 20th century. So it is a symbol of, what happens, the discrimination of Mizrahim, at least at the political level in Jerusalem. In some way, maybe it's disconnected, but still an interesting symbol. He comes from Givatayim, a different city. He moved into Jerusalem in order to get elected. And also is a modern Orthodox Jew. But I would say more than everything else is a Masorti type of a mayor. And Masorti is a special social category in Israel between secularism and orthodoxy. Most of the people that call themselves Masorti or traditional in English are Mizrahi Jews, but not only, but it is identified with them. And they have, I would say, less antagonistic point of view towards the relationship between religion and state, between seculars and religions. They live in between, they live in both worlds, and they don't see it as a binary thing, 0 and 1. And this is also the way he governs the city, I would say on an everyday basis. He doesn't have big strategies to the city, which is a problematic thing, but he does invest in the everyday of the city, in cleaning the street, in finding particular solutions to each community that has a problem or an issue, in, I would say, turning off every small fire that erupts between communities. It's it's a good strategy to handle a contested city as Jerusalem on some level, but maybe on the long term, some problems you can't really evade on an everyday basis. And maybe I will finish in a positive tone, if that wasn't positive enough. Jerusalem is still a hub of social and cultural entrepreneurship, of community projects such as Poel Yerushalayim, the fans club that became a very successful club in soccer, of new restaurants, even non-kosher ones like Talbia, or Beit, a house that hosts encounters between Jews and Palestinians, of cultural artistic institutions like Amifal, and also important innovation in the field of education. Jerusalem today is the center of innovation in education, especially secular and let's say Orthodox Jewish education, and people are actually moving into the city to join the variety of schools that it offers. So things are still happening in Jerusalem. It still fosters creativity, especially bottom up. And people living in Jerusalem are always aware to differences, to diversity, to social inequality, and always trying to find by themselves solutions to various problems that the municipality doesn't handle, and of course not the government. And maybe finish with that, we talked a lot about East-West relations, and a study that I conducted in the last decade was focused on what I called a shared society initiatives in Jerusalem. And we saw that actually in the last decades, especially since 2014 and on, Jerusalem became a hub of innovation in the area of shared society, of connecting between groups, between Jewish women and Palestinian women, between Haredi and seculars, and sometimes both at the same, a triangular encounter. And in the map, you see I mapped those initiatives, approximately 45 different initiatives that are all bottom-up, very interesting ones. Most of them are initiated in West Jerusalem. That is part of the power imbalance in the city, but located on the seam line between East and West. And I want to finish the series with that point of view. Of course, as I said, there are major questions regarding the future of Jerusalem. Some of them seem like questions that are very hard to answer on a policy level, political level, and etc. How this city will hold itself with such polarization between East and West, secular and Haredi. But still, we also see that Jerusalem is a major metropolitan center. Million people are living in Jerusalem, and the residents of Jerusalem have a lot of, I would say, social capital, a lot of community capital, I would even say, and a lot of new innovative ideas, and they create solutions. So I hope you enjoyed the series, and if you have questions regarding this episode, but also things I talked about in earlier ones, this is the time.
Thank you very much, Marik. I must say I've lived in Jerusalem my whole life, and I've learned quite a lot from you. So thank you. We'll begin with the first question. When in peace negotiations, it is mentioned the option of returning to the borders of 67 and make Jerusalem an international city. What does that mean geographically and politically?
So right after 1967, there was a plan that was, I would say, promoted by actually the US government back then. That plan actually prompted the establishment of some of the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem as sort of the way that the Israeli government tried to put facts on the ground and to tackle the idea that Jerusalem can be internationalized and kind of create a new geography that it would be clear Israel controls this area, it's an annexed territory, nobody will come and internationalize it. Me personally, I think it's not a bad idea. Maybe the old city can benefit much more for having a patronage of different religions, different states. It's a city that belongs to the world, not only to us, and I think it will benefit from it.
Okay. Our next question is, what is the percentage of Palestinians living in new Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, like French Hill, Gilo, and Givat Ze'ev?
Good question, and it's a very interesting thread. As I mentioned, there are 12 neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, that were built as mass areas in East Jerusalem. Today, I would say 40% of the Jewish population in the city lives in those neighborhoods, like Gilo, the French Hill, and etc. Until recently, demographically, it was only Jewish neighborhoods, but also in the last decade, as part of the process I described, we see some movement of Palestinians moving into neighborhoods at the north, mostly Pisgat Ze'ev and the French Hill. In the French Hill, the percentage of Palestinian population amounts around 20 to 25% of the neighborhood. In Pisgat Ze'ev, which is a much larger neighborhood, there are numerically, in absolute numbers, more Palestinians living there, but their percentage is around maybe 5%.
Is this due to lack of space in the in the East Jerusalem neighborhoods, or trying to get a better lifestyle?
Would say both. Those families that move into those neighborhoods are middle class families. In the French Hill specifically, most of them are Palestinian citizens of Israel from the Galilee or the center that immigrate to the city to work or to study, and they find it more comfortable to live in a Jewish neighborhood on the seam line, so they can send their kids to an Arab school in East Jerusalem, but still enjoy the facilities of a modern neighborhood, a Jewish neighborhood, and they are not afraid of living among Jews because they are citizens of Israel, they know Hebrew and etc. But also we see that some middle-class Palestinians from East Jerusalem move to Pisgat Ze'ev. Yeah. They want to enjoy the quality of life, and some of them can bear the fact that they live within a Jewish Israeli space. Yeah.
You spoke about the fact that the light rail and the parks bring people from East Jerusalem into West Jerusalem. Does it work both way? Are the parks in East Jerusalem visited by West Jerusalemers?
Well, as I mentioned, there are almost no parks in East Jerusalem, so that's not an issue. But even if they were, the relationship between East and West are not symmetric. This is very important. The dependency are asymmetric, meaning when you are a Jew growing up in West Jerusalem, you really don't need to cross into East Jerusalem unless you want to go to the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, and you cross the Muslim Quarter. You don't need because you have everything you need in West Jerusalem, basically. When you grow up in East Jerusalem, you can't go on through life without crossing the boundaries, without going pay taxes at the municipality, to work in West Jerusalem, to shop in West Jerusalem, or if you want to go to a park, you would go there. So it's not a symmetric situation.
So we're talking about, I think we'll end with not being symmetrical, and we all wish for Jerusalem happy days and a brighter future, and for all, I think, the citizens living here. Thank you very much, Malik, for this whole enlightening series, and thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.